So it's my great honor to introduce our next keynote speaker, Professor Mary Janow, Dean of the Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. Professor Janow is a renowned expert in international trades and investments with a lifetime experience in Asia-Pacific area. She also served a 4-year term at the Appellate body of the WTO, which is the ultimate court for appeals between disputes of the WTO members. Professor Janow, in her terms, was involved in 35 appeal cases. I'm not going to go through all the extensive accomplishment of Professor Janow's, because her bio is the full bio is in our brochure. I just want to mention she just came back from a long flight from an Asia trip yesterday, and she joined us today still after the exhaustion of the travel. So we really appreciate the dedication and the support to TCFA. The keynote speaker, this next session will be in a form of a fireside chat. Professor Janow will be interviewed by Susan Feng, the lead correspondent of China's Haixin U.S. area. Susan is a great reporter and has been a long-term TCFA friend. She's also a producer of a series of popular documentaries. So let's welcome Professor Janow and Susan up to the stage.
Thanks very much for the kind introduction. And Professor, it's such an honor and pleasure to be here with you.
Well, thank you. I'm a great admirer of TCFA. I think you have accomplished a lot. You have an extraordinary membership. And here you are on a Sunday afternoon. So I thank you for inviting me.
17 years after World War II, we are in a moment of historic change right now. The global economy, global politics, all, seems has a lot of bumper, and, it's kind of, the world we know is kind of shaking. It seems right now populism is everywhere. And we have Brexit, and we have Trump as president, and we have the looming trade war between US and China. So, Professor, what's your worldview now? I know a lot of people's worldview right now is very dark. So what's your view now?
Well, I'm an optimist, and when you think about various periods in American history, in American modern history, I think of the late 1960s as one of the most complicated, dark periods. We are in a very different situation today. But still, I think we have to think hard about the moment we are in and what has produced what I think is a deep anxiety in the United States and also in developed economies about the future.
Yeah.
There are a lot of data that is now widely talked about, and some of my faculty at Columbia University, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Suresh Naidu, and others, have really brought to the surface this question of inequality,
yes.
And inequality particularly in developed economies,
yes.
where we have seen in advanced economies, the conditions where people feel that their futures and their children's futures are far less positive than a generation ago.
Yeah.
And the data supports that. The data showed that in about 1940, children were going to lead more prosperous lives than their parents. But by 1970, that had changed, and now only about 40% of young people were going to live appreciably more financially successful lives than their parents. So there are lots of data that show that the inequality situation has become very great within countries, even though between countries there has been a lot of growth and poverty alleviation.
I think that partially explained why the trade is not popular word anymore, because, you know, it's in the economic data is very well established that on the whole, you know, trade make a country richer. But how about who get the benefit? It's the top, only the top, not the bottom, or someone in the middle. I think maybe that's why, because the big, you know, the inequality that make trade, you know, it's like more, it's not popular anymore. Do you think?
Well, first, I would just say a little bit more before we talk specifically about trade. I mean, fundamentally, I'm an optimist because I think, you know, societies are alleviating disease. There is less war than there used to be. Fewer people are dying from starvation. There are extraordinary innovations occurring through technology and scientific breakthroughs. So, you know, we need to look at the whole picture.
The big picture.
Yeah, the whole picture. But we also have to look at the parts of our economy and society whose lives are not improving.
Yes.
And with respect to that population, I think trade is often blamed. Now, I think a consensus view among economists is that automation explains much more about what's happened to manufacturing employment than international trade.
But it's hard to blame technology, right? You know, it's easy to blame trade than to blame technology because that's just a machine there, you know.
Well, I think it is a combination.
Yes, it's a combination.
And the answer is not to explain to someone who's been badly affected that it's not trade, it's automation. That is not an answer to those people who are suffering. We have to find solutions that support those people and give them hope for the future. That's our great failing.
That's very much needed right now. Yeah. But from the bigger picture, do you think, since we see the populace is everywhere, you know, it's in Europe, it's in all the developed economy, do you think are we in the watershed of the global economy?
I think we're in a period of change, and we need to think hard about what are the responses needed within countries and across countries with respect to the global system. Within countries, I would hope that in the United States, we would invest more in education, we would invest more in infrastructure, we'd invest more in R&D. These are steps that need to happen to make our own economy and society more vital. I think there's also a loss of confidence in international institutions.
Sure.
And I find, you know, that young people don't necessarily appreciate these institutions because they're underperforming and they're quite flawed. But to recreate them is extremely difficult. So it seems to me that what we should do is preserve and improve the system, not throw it out.
Of course, it takes a war, you know, a world war to get this system, you know, and it served us very well in the past 70 years.
Yes.
Yeah. And with regarding to the U.S.-China relation, because today most of the audience, you know, are in one way or another related to China. So that's very, it's very important issue. It's in everyone's mind. Like, you know, things are different. Like in 2007, the U.S.-China's economy are intertwined so together. The historian Neil Ferguson called it Chengyang. And I talked to him in last summer, and he said Chengyang survived after the 2008 financial crisis. And Thomas Friedman said U.S.-China are one country, two systems. So, but right now in current situation, do you think the economy, the two economies are still very intertwined together? A lot of people want to unwind the two economies.
I think we are in a very serious moment in U.S.-China relations, and the sources of tension are both economic and security.
Yes.
The economic relationship, I think, had been part of the important glue,
Yes.
but the tensions there have increased, and the American business community that has been so important for that relationship has become increasingly skeptical
Yes.
that the Chinese marketplace will continue to open and that foreign firms will get what is perceived as fair access to the Chinese market. And with that erosion in the context of broader security tensions, it's creating a very serious situation. I'm sure everyone here has read or should read, I would recommend, a speech by Vice President Pence on October 4th at the Hudson Institute. I don't think his views represent everyone's views, but with respect to the U.S. government, it's very important to understand his perspectives. He characterized U.S.-China relations as being in a period of great power competition.
Yes.
And that is, in fact, the terminology used in the national security strategy of the United States. And he asserted that China is contesting American geopolitical advantages and trying to change the international system. Earlier this week, I was at the New Economy Forum organized by Mr. Bloomberg in Singapore, which brought many leaders together. And Vice President Wang Jishan was there, and he gave a very sober speech. And he spoke about U.S.-China relations being at a historic crossroads, I think is the word that he used. And while speaking harshly about unilateralism and advancing the importance of a rule of law-based system, he said China will stay calm and sober-minded and embrace greater openness. I think those are important words, and I very much hope that that occurs. He also stressed the need for the West to appreciate China's history
Yes.
and the humiliation that China had experienced by the imperial powers and how that continues to shape the Chinese psychology. So, you know, this is the first time after 40 years of progress in economic integration that you are hearing this talk about decoupling
Yes.
in a serious way in Washington. I think
So
we
that's
will
real.
see some partial.
Yes.
Don't overcharacterize, I would say. I think it's important to stay calm
Yeah.
and not to overcharacterize. But there is a serious situation here, and there are steps being taken and signaling to the market as a result of this tension. So what kind of decoupling are we talking about? Well, I think you are already beginning to see some adjustments occurring in the supply chains
Yes.
as a result of the tariff tensions. That is one thing. Businesses are making sometimes different choices.
Make adjustment, right?
It does not happen overnight. Clearly, it will be affected by what happens next. And you're also seeing the introduction in the United States of more screening of Chinese foreign direct investment in the
Yes.
United States. Chinese outbound FDI at the scale of which we've seen in recent years is very new. And I think there is much learning that still is occurring for outbound FDI. It will obviously be harder
Yes.
in technology areas than it was, and FDI screening here has undergone some adjustments, but it has not undergone as severe adjustments as was thought by some. So I think it is premature to really say that we are moving into decoupling. I think the risks have gone up. The market signal is making companies very cautious, understandably, and what really matters is that we are able to move forward now and find a path forward
it's still possible for U.S. and China to find a common ground to reach consensus, and that's what I think. It's Henry Paulson. He was in the Singapore conference. He asked this same question. He said it's very hard to reach consensus now. But how do you think? Do you think it's possible for the two sides to still find a common ground?
Yeah, I think Hank Paulson gave a very important speech at the Bloomberg Forum, and he did use the term the risk of an economic iron curtain, which caught a lot of attention. I think that, again, it's the risk of an economic iron curtain. And he pointed to the fact that there were divergent interests between the United States and China where there should be cooperation. And in that respect, he pointed, for example, to North Korea, which is one area where there should be cooperation. He also pointed to the idea of cyber sovereignty, which is a concept that is being espoused by China, and at a moment in history where cross-border data flows are increasingly important for economic vitality. And so these are areas of divergent interest, as well as, I think, a growing frustration by global business about the pace and maybe the direction of market opening in China. Now, Chinese leadership is now saying that they want to open more, they intend to open more, that they are committed to the international rule-based system. These are important words, and I think in the months ahead, I remain hopeful that some progress can be achieved. But this is not a problem that is only the result of this president or this moment in time. I think there are a number of sources of problems, and we'll have to develop a multi-layered strategy of engagement to get at these problems. Some can be resolved in the near term through regulatory changes within China, through further liberalization. Others are more systemic in character, issues having to do with the role of SOEs and how the government supports SOEs and the consequences in the marketplace. Those will require more systemic conversations, and not just bilaterally, I think multilaterally.
So you think basically saying that the problem is a long-term, it's not, was we have for the, one-day problem. It's a long-term problem. It's accumulated problems, between these two countries, and we'll expect, we solve the problem. It's like, it's a long-term solution.
Well, I think there's not a simple answer to this.
Yes.
I mean, by many measures, China made the most ambitious protocol of accession of any developing country when it joined the WTO in 2001. But there were many areas that were not covered in that protocol, particularly with respect to services. Mm-hmm. And I think the Chinese economy has changed a lot in those since that time. Mm-hmm. And there's been a growing view within China that it's time for further steps forward. But maybe that was slowed down by the financial crisis and its aftermath. Yeah. Also, there's a lot of foreign direct investment in China, so it is not the case that China has been entirely closed to foreign investment. Mm-hmm. But I think you hear more and more the view that the nature of that investment has been constrained, it's been structured in ways that give firms less than full opportunity in the Chinese market.
Yeah, and it seems this time is different. This time, the American business community, it seems they stand behind President Trump, to ask for, China to have more open, more market access and more protection of intellectual property. Do you think the business community kind of lined up, they want action?
Yes. I think that is correct. And I think there's a lot that China can do and says that it wants to do. So it's important to act. Hank Paulson made a good point. He said, let's tone down the rhetoric and get to business.
Okay.
I think he's exactly right.
Yeah. But with regarding the, right now, the current issue is the trade war. The trade war, the China, the U.S. put $200 billion on the two-way trade, in the tariff. If it cannot be solved, it will have very serious consequences to the two economy and to the global economy.
Yes, I mean, I think trade wars can escalate. It's not the 250 billion, it's the market signaling that causes and the after effects in many different areas. So it's important that we engage on investment questions,
Yes.
on market access, on the regulatory dimensions. We need a multi-pronged engagement. Some can be resolved, I think, in the near term. Others will take longer term steps.
So you think the compromise will not be made in the short term? In the near term?
I think it would be a mistake to think that the situation is just tactical and associated with this president. I don't think so. I
Okay.
think there is progress that can be achieved to reduce some of the friction,
Yeah.
but we will need a longer term engagement.
But how far will the tariff go before the compromise can be struck?
You'll have to ask people in Washington and Beijing. I think both are signaling a willingness to engage.
Yeah, President Trump recently, he's kind of optimistic about the trade, the result of the trade dispute, because the two leaders will meet at the end of this month, the G20 meeting. Do you think his optimism is shared with Americans' business community?
Look, my feeling is that there are many concrete things that can be done on the economic agenda to reduce tension, and my hope is that both sides will get very concrete about those measures. But I don't think this is a situation that's going to be resolved right away, and I think there's very little time before the G20 meeting.
Yes.
So my hope is that we will get some serious engagement on those areas that lend themselves to amelioration and working groups working hard on those medium-term measures.
Okay.
If China is in fact committed to opening up its economy more.
So you think it's up to China to give the trade war a stop, some.
I think the grievances are real, many of them, and so there needs to be serious engagement and concrete action. It's not going to be enough to just
Sure.
say that China wants to open.
Yes.
Now, the U.S. has reached agreement, as you saw, also in a very brinksmanship-like fashion
Yes.
with Canada and Mexico.
We
there-
read NAFTA, right?
the new NAFTA,
Yes.
U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement. And, it's interesting, that agreement, because it has embedded in it many features of the TPP agreement
Yes.
that the U.S. Pulled out of. And, of course, TPP has moved forward without the United States, in part because of Japan's leadership.
Yes.
And the new NAFTA includes elements that I think are important for the future economy. It includes provisions on digital trade, for example. And it also includes some adjustments with respect to domestic content, a provision that says that the parties will consider the framework if any of them get into deals with the non-market economy.
Yeah.
That's clearly aimed
To China.
at China. It has provisions on state-owned enterprises. So there have been some reforms, including reducing protection for cross-border investment. So it's not the same NAFTA, but it's not a dramatically different
Yeah.
NAFTA either. So it's important to study what that means for this administration.
Yeah, it is. Like the Trump administration rewrites the NAFTA, they have this provision that forbid other countries to sign the same trade pact with non-market economy as China. And also the rich deal with South Korea, they're talking with Japan. Even more importantly, they're talking with EU to reach that great deal. Actually, President Obama did that too. Obama administration tried to build the transatlantic investment and trade partnership, but it never worked. Do you think it's possible, for U.S. and the EU to reach a trade deal? And does this mean a new WTO, a new trade system is emerging?
Well, I think the WTO situation is also extremely serious. And it is not clear whether the U.S. wants to strengthen it or has lost confidence fundamentally in the WTO. The U.S., Europe, and Japan are talking together about some features like subsidy reform protocol. The U.S. has expressed a lot of dissatisfaction with the appellate body on which I used to serve. At this point, some of the things that they say are necessary reforms, I think can be reformed quite straightforwardly if we can get major countries to talk to each other. Others are much harder to do. The U.S. says the appellate body should just apply the words as written. Well, that doesn't answer the question. Often, the words are not clear, and so the appellate body has to interpret the words to come up with meaning. And so there's a lot of work to be done, I think, to revitalize the WTO, which has stood still since 1994, essentially.
A lot of people in China, especially when I was in China this summer, the news come out that United States will have a trade talk with EU. A lot of people are very nervous, a new WTO is emerging without China.
I don't see a new WTO emerging. I think this is a moment.
Maybe a new trade system is emerging without China. People are worried about that a lot.
We are seeing bilateral and regional arrangements proliferating. I think this is a moment to preserve the multilateral system as much as we can and to advance those areas where we can. It's not the time to conclude that there's a new system without China. China has said it's committed to the multilateral system. Let's see what it can do.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We're getting flashing signs. Please wrap up, so we will do that. Pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure. Thank you.